The morning lay heavy over the valley, as if the light itself hesitated to descend between the ridges. A thin mist clung to the pines and drifted low across the uneven fields, softening the edges of the world. It moved like a living thing, slipping around the stumps left by old logging crews and the weather-worn fencing that divided one patch of stubborn land from another. The mountains towered above it all, their slopes scarred by years of mining and storms, standing silent and immovable as the seasons that shaped them. Eliza Marrow walked the narrow trail behind her house long before the first wagons rolled into town. She carried no lantern. She knew the path by memory, by the soft give of the soil beneath her boots and the faint pulse she felt through the ground when she paused to listen. The forest had become a kind of companion, not gentle but familiar, whispering in the creak of branches and the distant rumble of the river pushing through stone. She had learned to read these sounds the way others read letters on a page, piecing together warnings the mountain offered to those patient enough to hear them. The remains of the old Marrow house waited behind her like a burden she could not lay down. Its roof sagged on one side, and the porch bowed inward as though the earth meant to swallow it whole. Each spring she patched what she could, hammering loose boards back into place, hauling stones from the riverbed to shore up the foundation. The work never ended, but the rhythm of it steadied her. It kept her from thinking too long about the silence that followed her parents' deaths, or about the weight of isolation that settled over the property at dusk. By midday, the air warmed, carrying the distant clamor of the annual fair where the townsfolk gathered in a scatter of tents and makeshift stalls. The noise rose and fell like waves breaking against rock, laughter, the clatter of hooves, a harmonica drifting out of tune. Eliza moved through the crowd with the same quiet steadiness she carried in the woods, her shoulders drawn inward, her attention turned to the subtle tremor beneath her feet. Few noticed her, though those who did watched her with a blend of curiosity and unease, as if her calm presence unsettled the careless noise around them. Among the strangers passing through that day was Isaac Lorne, who had spent the last several years drifting from one frontier town to another, never staying long enough for his shadow to settle. The war had carved something hollow into him, something that no drink or distance could quite fill. He stood at the edge of the fair, where the dust thinned and the pine shade crept close, surveying the crowd with the habits he had never managed to forget. Patterns of movement, shifts in posture, the restless energy that preceded trouble, he kept track of them as naturally as breathing. It was then that he noticed her, not through any deliberate search, but because she did not move like the others. While the crowd swayed and churned around her, she stood as if rooted to the earth itself, her gaze turned toward the distant line of mountains. A gust of wind stirred the dust around her boots, yet she remained still, listening with a concentration that suggested she heard something buried beneath the noise of the fair. Isaac watched the way her fingers curled slightly toward her palm, as if she were bracing against a sensation that touched her and her alone. The moment passed quickly. A supply wagon rattled by, forcing him to step backward, and when he looked again, she was already walking away, disappearing into the shifting sea of people. He did not follow. Instinct warned him against mistaking a fleeting curiosity for purpose, and he had spent too many years learning to question every impulse. Still, something about her lingered in his mind, a quiet intensity that stood in sharp contrast to the noise and color around her. Later that afternoon, he overheard two merchants discussing the outskirts of town, trading stories about the abandoned mines carved into the foothills. The shafts had been sealed decades earlier after a collapse killed half a crew, and since then, even the bravest locals approached the area with caution. They spoke of unstable ground, of hollow chambers deep beneath the roots of the forest, of strange echoes that sometimes rose through the rocks during storms. It was then that Isaac caught her name, spoken with a note of resigned pity. Eliza Marrow lived not far from those mines, they said, closer than anyone else. Some claim she felt tremors long before others did, that she knew when the valley meant to shift or when the wind carried a warning from the peaks. As the sun sank behind the western ridge, Isaac rode back toward the outskirts, though he had no clear reason to do so. The light stretched long across the valley, sharpening the shadows between the trees and turning the dust in the road to a muted gold. The mountains loomed larger with each mile, their silhouettes layered like dark waves frozen in time. A chill settled over the air, the kind that came not from temperature, but from the knowledge of untold depths beneath the surface. In the growing darkness, a faint tremor rippled through the ground, subtle enough that most would have missed it, but not subtle enough to be dismissed. Isaac paused, steadying his horse, and felt the slightest vibration travel through the earth and into his bones. He looked toward the line of trees where he'd seen her earlier, a strange sense of recognition threading through him. Somewhere beyond that quiet rise, the old mine tunnels wound under the valley like the veins of a buried creature. Somewhere beyond that, Eliza Marrow returned alone to her fragile home. The tremor faded, leaving only the whisper of wind and the distant groan of settling pines. But the valley held its breath as night gathered, and the mountains cast their long shadows over the land, as if guarding a secret waiting to surface. Isaac continued his ride with a tightening unease, sensing that the day's quiet moments were merely the first stirrings of something larger, something shaped by the silence of the girl he had watched from afar and the depths of the mountains she called home.
The broken horseshoe had forced Isaac to dismount long before he reached the nearest settlement. The trail wound along the flank of the ridge in uneven switchbacks, narrow enough that each step required caution. He walked with the reins looped loosely in his hand, listening to the muted clatter of the horse's hooves against stone. Late afternoon light slanted through the pines, catching on dust suspended in the air, and the wind moved in thin breaths through the branches, as though unwilling to disturb the stillness gathered there. It was during one of those pauses along the trail that he first heard it, a distant, resonant hum rising through the ground like the exhale of some concealed presence. It vibrated faintly in his boots, too low to be mistaken for thunder, and too steady to be dismissed as a passing echo. Isaac stopped to listen, turning his head toward the mountainside, though the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the mountain itself released a warning no one else had asked to hear. When the tremor faded, an unease settled over him, neither sharp nor immediate, but persistent enough to quicken his pace. The trail curved sharply around a stand of firs, and the land opened into a shallow clearing. There, at the edge of a slope that dropped toward an unseen ravine, stood a small house, weathered, stoic, and reaching toward the failing light with the weary determination of something long fought for. Isaac recognized it from the description he had overheard in town, the lonely structure belonging to the girl from the fair. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin, wavering line, dissipating as soon as it touched the colder air above the treetops. Eliza Marrow stepped out onto the porch as he approached, her posture guarded, her gaze unwavering. There was no surprise in her expression, only a quiet resolve, as though she had been expecting the arrival of a stranger on her land. The dust on her boots and the wind-blown strands of hair framing her face marked the hours she had likely spent outside, watching the valley with the same attentive stillness he had witnessed days earlier. Her eyes moved not only to him, but also to the ridge behind him, to the clouds gathering along the upper slopes, to the faint plume of dust rising from where the trail had crumbled under his horse's weight. It was as if she read the landscape the way others read weathered maps, drawing meaning from the smallest shifts. He explained his situation with a steady gesture toward the horse, and she nodded once, her expression softening only slightly. She motioned for him to follow her around the side of the house, where a makeshift workbench held tools worn from years of use. As she inspected the damaged horseshoe, her focus remained divided. partly on the metal in her hands, partly on the valley stretched out below, where shadows thickened in the descending light. Isaac could not help noticing the subtle tension in her stance, as though she was listening for something beyond the reach of ordinary hearing. The house itself bore the marks of time and neglect. Shingles peeled from the roof in brittle curls, and the siding had grown pale and rough from seasons of rain and bitter winds. Yet it held a sense of purpose, shaped by the labor of a family who had refused to abandon the land even when the mines collapsed and the valley emptied. Later, Isaac learned from the few who dared to speak of it that the hollowed tunnels beneath the mountains had weakened the ground, leaving silent chambers where sound traveled strangely and the earth shifted without warning. It was said that only a fool or someone with nowhere else to go would choose to remain this close to such uncertainty. Eliza moved through the space with the familiarity of someone who had known its every flaw since childhood. Her father had continued to work near the mines long after others had left, clinging to the belief that the land still held value, still carried the memory of their family carved into its soil. She remained out of loyalty to that conviction, though the house creaked at night with the strain of the shifting ground, and the valley whispered warnings she could not always ignore. Isaac offered to help with the repairs almost before the thought had formed, finding in the gesture a clarity he had not felt in years. He climbed onto the roof with a hammer in hand, testing each board carefully, sensing the way the structure responded beneath his weight. Eliza steadied the ladder and handed up shingles and nails, speaking little, but watching each step as if gauging the strength of both the wood and the man repairing it. When the sun dipped behind the mountains, they worked by the dim light of a lantern hung from a beam, the glow casting long shadows across the porch. He told himself he would leave once the repairs were finished, that the broken horseshoe had led him here by accident, not intention. But each morning brought a new task, mending a fence, hauling water from the narrow creek, and clearing debris from the path where small landslides had torn away the outer edges. He worked with a steady calm, and she allowed him to stay without questioning his reasons, though both sensed the quiet thread forming between them, something tentative yet undeniable. At night, when the valley settled into darkness, Eliza lay awake listening to the faint vibrations that traveled through the ground. They always came before an event, small shifts in the soil, changes in the unseen hollows beneath the ridge. The tremors were her earliest memories, as familiar as her father's voice had once been. She felt them now with the same clarity, though she kept this truth to herself. Each quiver reminded her that the land she depended on could betray her at any moment, and she feared that revealing this ability would change the fragile balance beginning to form between her and the man who repaired her roof without question. The nights grew colder, the valley darker, and the mountains heavier with unspoken tension. Isaac lingered longer each day, his presence settling into the quiet rhythms of the house as naturally as the shifting shadows on the walls. And though Eliza never confessed the secret she carried in her bones, the earth beneath them continued to murmur in the darkness, echoing through the hidden tunnels like a warning meant for her alone.
The mornings in the valley had grown sharper, the air carrying a weight that pressed against the skin and tightened the chest. Eliza rose before dawn, as she had for years, and moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb Isaac, even as she felt the pulse beneath her feet. The ground had begun to hum more insistently, subtle vibrations that seemed to travel through the boards, through the soil, through the very walls that held their fragile home. She stepped onto the porch and bent forward, letting her hands rest lightly on the railing, closing her eyes to listen. The rhythm was irregular, a deep, steady pressure that pulled at her awareness like the breath of a living mountain. Isaac stirred on the bedroll he had left near the door. He noticed her absence immediately, and with a rising unease followed her steps outside. The cold bit at his cheeks, but it did not matter. He watched as she leaned there, utterly still, her long hair brushing her shoulders, and sensed the intensity of her focus. He could see the tension in her back, the way her hands clutched the railing, subtle enough for a stranger to miss, but impossible for him not to notice. The land seemed to answer her, moving in ways that no one else could perceive, whispering in the low language of tremors and hidden hollows. In the town below, whispers had begun to circulate. Miners who had worked the abandoned shafts long ago spoke of noises beneath the earth, of sudden gusts that tossed loose debris into the wind. Animals were unsettled, fleeing without cause from the slopes, their instincts sharper than any human judgment. Some claimed the disturbances were signs, others called them omens, and slowly fingers began to point toward the girl who had always been apart, who spent hours in silence with the mountain. Isaac heard fragments of these rumors, and though he did not trust gossip, a tight knot of anxiety formed in his chest. Something in the air, in the pulse of the valley, seemed to confirm the warnings. That afternoon, Isaac accompanied her down the slope toward the old shaft entrances. He kept his eyes on the weathered timbers, the cracked boards, the earth that had begun to sag under the years of neglect. Eliza moved with a quiet certainty, scanning the ground, feeling vibrations invisible to him, and he realized that each step she took was calculated, informed by knowledge he could not hope to share. When a small piece of timber creaked and bent under pressure, her hands shot out instinctively, brushing the edge of the railing, measuring the tension, and letting the ground speak to her. She did not explain. She never had, and Isaac did not ask. He could only observe, noting the furrow in her brow, the tightening of her jaw, the subtle shifts in her posture as if she were negotiating with forces invisible. He saw her eyes close and her chest rise and fall with the mountain's breath, and he understood that this was no ordinary fear. She was attuned to the earth, to its secret movements, and in that attunement lay both a danger and a remarkable strength. The weight of her responsibility pressed on him, too, though he could not name it, only feel it, in the tightening of his stomach and the tension in his shoulders. Night fell with a slow, heavy certainty. The valley was enveloped in a darkness thick with anticipation. Stars glimmered dimly behind a veil of clouds, and the wind carried the scent of wet stone and pine resin. Isaac and Eliza returned to the house, their steps slow, measured, each listening for the subtle vibrations that had grown steadily stronger over the course of the day. Inside, she moved about her work without a word, gathering supplies, checking boards and beams, as though she could coax stability from the very bones of the building. He followed, assisting without direction, instinctively, feeling a growing admiration for her vigilance and the quiet authority with which she governed the small, precarious world around her. The subtle connection between them deepened in the silence. Every shared glance, every measured movement seemed to draw them closer, their presence entwined not by conversation, but by necessity and shared awareness. Isaac watched her as she paused at the threshold of the shaft, her hands tracing the cracks in the timbers, listening, feeling, reading the faintest hints of movement. He felt his pulse accelerate with concern, and yet there was something magnetic in the way she moved, a pull he could not resist. He realized that he had come to rely on her perception, and in turn, she seemed to sense the steadiness he offered in a world that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. By the middle of the night, the vibrations had intensified. Eliza awoke, slipping silently to the porch once more. Isaac, now fully alert to the rhythm she felt, followed instinctively. They stood together in the cold, shoulder to shoulder, their silence unbroken. The ground beneath their feet trembled in quiet undulations, subtle yet persistent, signaling the mounting pressure trapped beneath the earth. Isaac understood now that the danger was not coming from outside, but from beneath, from the very foundation on which the house stood. Yet the fear that gripped him was tempered by the presence of Eliza. Her calm, unwavering focus acted as a tether, allowing him to endure the uncertainty. Hours passed in the quiet communion with the mountain. Eliza's hands moved lightly over the railing, guiding her perception, interpreting the vibrations, and he sensed the subtle changes in her expression, flickers of concern, brief moments of triumph when she discerned a pattern, a rhythm, a warning he could not hear. They returned to the house only when the first light of dawn began to touch the ridgetops, casting the valley in muted gold and shadow. The tension in the earth had not abated, but it had shifted, and the temporary relief was mirrored in the way he noticed her shoulders relax ever so slightly. They settled back into the house, the long night having drawn them closer in ways words could never capture. Each understood the precarious balance that held the land, the house, and their fragile trust together. Outside, the valley remained restless, whispering through the hollows and along the slopes, carrying its hidden threats, and Isaac recognized that whatever came, they would face it together. In the quiet shared between them, a bond was forged, tethered not by declarations, but by shared vigilance, mutual respect, and the unspoken understanding that the mountain's breath was theirs to heed, and together they could withstand it.
The valley had grown restless, a subtle tension weaving through the trees and across the slopes. Small tremors began to ripple beneath the soil, too faint for anyone but Eliza to notice at first, but persistent enough to stir anxiety in the town below. Rumors spread quickly, twisting around her like a shadow, painting her as the cause of misfortune rather than a witness to it. Neighbors whispered of the strange noises beneath the earth, of the animals fleeing the hills, of the subtle quivers in the ground that seemed to follow her footsteps. The air felt heavier, charged with expectation, and the eyes of the town turned toward her in suspicion. One afternoon, a group of men appeared at the edge of her property, their boots crunching against the gravel as they approached with a mixture of anger and fear. They demanded that she leave the valley, that she abandon the land she had inherited and the home she had tried to preserve. Isaac stepped forward, placing himself between them and Eliza, his presence a solid barrier of resolve. The men hesitated, sizing him up, but the calm authority in his posture and the steady gaze he directed toward them forced their retreat. They left, murmuring under their breath, but the tension did not dissipate. Eliza sensed the increase in pressure beneath her feet, the subtle vibrations that signaled the gathering of force deep in the earth. Each day she became more attuned to the patterns, the shifting of stones, the faint whispers of rock grinding against rock. She felt the valley breathe beneath her, heard the slow movement of subterranean walls, and understood that a larger collapse was imminent. The old shafts, carved into the mountain decades ago, had weakened, and the timbers shuddered under the slow but relentless strain. Every creak of wood and murmur of stone became a language, one she could read with a clarity that unnerved Isaac, though he did not question it. One night, drawn by instinct, Eliza moved toward the abandoned mine entrance. The air was colder here, heavier, carrying the scent of damp stone and the faint echo of centuries-old shifts. Isaac followed silently, trusting her judgment, without fully understanding the source of her urgency. The ground beneath their boots hummed faintly, a warning of the movement deep in the mountain.
Eliza paused at the threshold, bending low to place her hand against the cold timber, feeling the vibrations travel through her fingertips and into her awareness. The cracks in the rock had widened faster than she had anticipated, and the pressure was uneven, unpredictable. Isaac watched her, noting the way her posture spoke of both caution and authority, her movements deliberate and precise. For the first time, she allowed him to witness the path of her perception, guiding him over the uneven ground and toward the points where the shifts were strongest. He began to see the pattern she discerned in the subtle undulations of the soil, the places where timbers might fail first, where stone might give way. The realization settled on him fully. This was not magic, nor superstition, nor the whispered fears of the townspeople. It was a profound attunement to the earth, an ability to read the subtle currents and pressures that others could not perceive. Together, they began to fortify the old structures, working quietly as shadows stretched across the slopes. Isaac lifted beams into place, while Eliza assessed the tension, placing supports where the strain was greatest. Each action was guided by the silent dialogue she maintained with the mountain, and he followed her lead with a careful trust that grew as they labored. Hours passed in the cold air, their movements synchronized, the rhythm of their work entwined with the breathing of the earth beneath them. There was no conversation, only a shared awareness, each responding to the subtle cues and warnings that the ground provided. Night deepened, and the valley seemed to hold its breath. The small tremors continued, shifting beneath the weight of years and the passage of time. Isaac observed her carefully, recognizing the fatigue in her movements, but also the unwavering determination that anchored them both. Her hands were steady, her focus absolute, and the strength of her connection to the land imbued the work with a quiet urgency. He felt a growing admiration and awe, a recognition that she possessed a rare and formidable skill, one that allowed them to fight against the slow, invisible threat that gathered in the hollows of the mountain. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the peaks, they had strengthened the most vulnerable supports and braced the entrances to the old shafts. Sweat and dust coated their skin, but a fragile sense of security had been achieved. Isaac understood that the danger was far from over, yet the collaboration between them had created a shield, however temporary, against the forces gathering beneath them. They stood together, side by side, hands sore, bodies tense, yet united in purpose. The valley remained watchful, the earth beneath them restless, but the partnership forged in silence and shared vigilance promised endurance. In the quiet moments that followed, as the wind whispered through the trees and the shadows receded, Eliza and Isaac exchanged glances that carried more meaning than words could hold. The connection between them had deepened, solidified, not through conversation, but through trust and shared responsibility. The land remained unpredictable, a living presence beneath their feet, yet they faced it together, each aware that the other was not merely a companion, but a necessary force in the delicate balance they struggled to maintain. The night had tested them, the tremors had warned, and they had responded as one.
The night settled over the valley with a deceptive calm, the moon casting pale silver light across the slopes. A distant rumble echoed through the mountains, subtle at first, then growing into a deep, resonant groan that vibrated through the soil beneath the feet of Eliza and Isaac. She stirred, sensing the shift before the ground betrayed them completely, her instincts pulling her from sleep with urgency. Isaac, alert to the slightest change, followed her lead as she moved through the dimly lit room, her eyes scanning the contours of the house and the outline of the surrounding slopes. The air felt electric, charged with tension, and every breath carried the scent of dust and dry earth disturbed by the approaching disaster. The first tremor struck with violent suddenness, shaking the floorboards and rattling the timbers of the old house. Eliza's feet moved instinctively, tracing the safest path she had memorized over countless nights, listening to the whispers of the ground. Isaac supported her without hesitation, guiding her toward the patch of open land just beyond the perimeter of the property, where the old oak and scrub provided minimal shelter but maximum visibility. Behind them, the slope quivered with increasing intensity, the groaning of stone and the snapping of splintering timber forming a chorus of warning that resonated through the valley. A section of the mountainside gave way, a massive sheet of earth and rock breaking free and tumbling downward. The sound was deafening, a rolling roar that shook the air and sent flocks of birds into frenzied flight. The old mine shafts trembled violently, dust and small stones cascading from their mouths as if the mountain itself had inhaled and now expelled with force. Eliza's eyes followed the fractures, reading the subtle changes in vibration, the shifts in weight and pressure that indicated where the collapse would strike next. Isaac matched her steps, moving quickly yet carefully, keeping pace with the rhythm of her perception and the unpredictable movements of the earth. From the distant edge of the valley, lights flickered as townspeople emerged, drawn by the sounds of catastrophe and the glow of fires ignited by falling debris. They watched from a distance, their fear mingling with confusion and suspicion. Rumors of curses and warnings whispered among them as they tried to comprehend the unfolding disaster. Some approached cautiously, drawn by curiosity and a desire to assign blame, their eyes fixed on Eliza as though she controlled the mountain itself. Isaac stood firm, placing himself as a shield between her and the mob, his posture firm, his presence unwavering against the mixture of fear and anger pressing toward them. Eliza's focus never wavered. She moved with precision, predicting the shift that would claim more of the mountainside if ignored. A section of the old shaft threatened to collapse completely, and she guided Isaac to reinforce the temporary barricades they had placed during the day. Timber groaned under the strain, dust plumes rising as the ground continued to shift violently. The pair worked silently, their movements a careful balance between urgency and caution. Each adjustment was calculated, a silent dialogue between human hands and the living mountain, a negotiation of survival played out in the language of vibrations and subtle shifts in the earth. The avalanche of rock and soil surged downward in successive waves, the sound reverberating through the valley like a drumbeat of doom. Trees splintered, and stones clattered across the slopes, but the old house remained intact, standing stubbornly amid the chaos. The townspeople, witnessing the house's survival, began to murmur among themselves, realizing that its endurance was not chance, but the result of Eliza's acute perception of the earth's movements. Slowly, understanding mixed with fear as they observed the calculated escape and the reinforcement of the structures. Through the night, the valley was a theater of light and shadow. Moonlight reflected off dust and rock, the firelight from torches flickering across the faces of the onlookers. The collapse continued in smaller, unpredictable bursts, each one sending tremors through the ground and dust clouds into the night air. Eliza and Isaac moved with synchronized certainty, each action designed to counter the mountain's unpredictable wrath. Sweat and dust coated their skin, and the chill of the night bit at them, yet neither faltered. Their unity, unspoken but absolute, became the only constant amid the chaos. By the early hours the main threat had passed, though the mountain still quivered with minor shifts. The crowd remained on the periphery, a mixture of awe and lingering suspicion keeping them rooted to the slopes. They had witnessed the near destruction of the land and the extraordinary ability of Eliza to navigate and survive it. Isaac remained by her side, his steady presence a silent affirmation that they faced not only the natural dangers together, but also the human judgments that followed. The night, though scarred by disaster, had forged a bond of trust and dependence, uniting them in purpose and in the quiet knowledge that they would endure the valley's fury together.
The morning light stretched across the valley, revealing a landscape scarred by the night's upheaval. Dust hung in the air, settling in layers over the fractured ground, the broken branches of trees, and the rubble that had cascaded from the slopes. Eliza's house stood amid the chaos, battered but unbowed, its walls scarred with dust and cracks, yet resilient, a testament to her endurance and the silent conversation she had with the land. The valley, once a place of quiet isolation, now felt alive with the weight of the storm that had passed and the cautious hope that lingered among the residents who had watched from afar. Villagers emerged tentatively from their homes, stepping carefully over fallen stones and twisted underbrush. Their eyes swept over the destruction, lingering on Eliza's house, which, despite its age and neglect, had survived the mountain's wrath. Where once there had been whispers of superstition and fear, now there was an unspoken acknowledgment of her role in preserving not only her own home, but the lives that might have been lost if the collapse had struck wider. Faces that had once avoided her now regarded her with a careful respect, measured and hesitant, as though they were learning to trust the unseen strength she carried. Isaac moved alongside her, their steps in harmony as they cleared paths through the debris. Stones were lifted, broken supports repositioned, and splintered wood realigned with precision. Each motion carried the weight of both necessity and care, a rhythm born of shared understanding. Dust coated their clothing, and the morning sun burned against their skin, but neither paused, for the task demanded both endurance and focus. The quiet labor of rebuilding became a bridge between them and the wary townspeople who watched from a distance, learning that the girl they had once feared was not a source of danger, but of guidance and resilience. Eliza worked with the same measured attention she applied to the earth itself, her hands steady as she tested each piece of timber, each stone for stability. Isaac mirrored her attentiveness, learning from her subtle gestures, following the cues of her eyes, the shift of her weight, the slight inclination of her head that indicated where support was needed. In this silent collaboration, the unspoken bond between them deepened. They spoke not in words, but in movements, in a shared understanding that survival demanded patience, skill, and mutual trust. As they moved across the property, Eliza began to teach Isaac to feel the land as she did. They paused at the edge of a slope, where the remnants of the landslide had left a scar across the earth. She pressed her palm against the soil, closing her eyes, and allowed her senses to reach into the depths, feeling the subtle vibrations that had once warned her of danger. Isaac followed her lead, placing his hand beside hers, attempting to discern the faint pulse of the ground beneath them. Slowly, haltingly at first, he began to perceive the rhythm, the subtle signals that spoke of stability and risk. The wind shifted through the valley, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and in that shared perception, a new layer of connection formed between them. Throughout the day they worked tirelessly, their movements a blend of practical labor and quiet communion. Broken walls were rebuilt with stronger beams, the precarious earth beneath the house reinforced with timber and stone, and the hollow pockets of the old mine shafts were filled and stabilized. The valley around them, once a theater of fear and destruction, began to show signs of renewal. Small shoots of greenery pushed through dust-laden soil, and the air, though still tinged with the scent of disturbed earth, carried the faint promise of spring. By mid-afternoon, the work was largely complete. The house, though weathered, had regained its stability. The ground beneath it was secure, and the mountain, which had loomed as a silent threat, now rested in a quiet equilibrium.
Isaac and Eliza stood side by side, surveying their labor. Their hands, marked with scratches and dust, rested momentarily on one another, a silent acknowledgment of shared effort and the trust forged in the crucible of disaster. In the distance, the villagers, previously skeptical, observed from the edges of the valley, their expressions a mixture of awe and respect. They had witnessed the resilience of the girl they once feared and the unwavering support of the man who stood with her. As the day faded into evening, a sense of calm settled over the valley. The sun dipped behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the slopes, and the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it a quiet promise of continuity and safety. Isaac remained by Eliza's side, his presence steady, a reassurance that no matter the fears of others or the lingering scars of the land, he would stay. She moved through the house and the surrounding land with ease, her confidence in her abilities and in him growing with every careful step. The partnership they had formed in crisis had evolved into a profound connection, rooted in trust, understanding, and shared purpose. Night fell fully, and the stars emerged in the clear sky above the Sierra Nevada foothills. The valley, scarred but secure, seemed to breathe in relief. Isaac and Eliza sat together on the porch of the house, looking over the land they had reclaimed. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and soil, mingling with the warmth of the fading sunlight. In the quiet, they shared a sense of accomplishment that words could not capture, a bond strengthened not only by the trials they had faced, but by the knowledge that they would face the future together, unshaken. Spring arrived slowly, bringing with it renewal. Trees budded and green shoots spread across the slopes, covering the scars left by the collapse. The house, now fully reinforced, stood firm against the changing seasons. Isaac learned to move through the valley with Eliza's awareness, feeling the subtle shifts and vibrations in the earth. Their movements together, a dialogue of trust and intuition. They cultivated the land, repaired fences, and ensured the safety of the property, each act reinforcing the permanence of their presence and the strength of their union. In the weeks that followed, the valley settled into a rhythm of quiet work and cautious peace. Villagers, once wary, came to respect the resilience and insight of Eliza, recognizing her not as a source of fear, but as a guardian of the land. Isaac, finally at home after years of wandering and uncertainty, found in this remote corner of Northern California a place to stay, to belong, and to build a life alongside the woman who had taught him to listen to the earth. Together they moved through each day with patience and care, the scars of the past forming a backdrop to a new beginning, their bond as enduring and steadfast as the mountains that rose protectively around them.